So I have an idea for a dystopian sci-fi flick. It's about a startup company that gets out of control and ends up conquering an entire world. Oh wait, that actually happened. The East India Company, a literal company that took over the entire Indian subcontinent. Often when people talk about the East India Company, they think it's like the British Empire disguising itself as a company. But really it's the other way around. The company begins in 1600 as a private enterprise sanctioned by the state and ends in 1874. After it's caused so much devastation that public pressure forces the British government to regulate it, thus creating the Raj. So how did this happen? How did a small company gain so much power? It's very complicated. So, it's the year 1600, and the Mughal Empire is one of the richest regions of the world. Like, by a lot. The only region that can even compete is the Ming Dynasty in China. And a little backwards island optimistically called Great Britain doesn't really come close. At this time, the British are no more concerned with world domination than they are with anal hygiene. Certain things never change. Instead, the British state wants to compete economically and militarily with its neighbors, the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and most importantly, the Dutch. Dun dun dun! Just because they eat sprinkles on Wonder Bread doesn't mean you should underestimate them. All these countries are a lot further along when it comes to capitalizing on the European demand for Asian luxury goods. Remember, we are in the height of mercantilism, in which nations measured their wealth by their supply of precious metals, as opposed to now, when national wealth is measured in vibes. America is one of the most in-debt countries in the world, and yet the dollar is strong, so I honestly don't know. Anyway, during this period, we measured a nation's wealth in its supply of silver and gold. So during the age of mercantilism, the economic goal was to import as few products as possible, thus keeping the supply of silver and gold within your own economy. The only problem is people like nice shit. And the nice things during this era happen to be mostly in Asia. I mean, what are you gonna buy from Europe in the 1500s? Venereal diseases? Those are free. So European gold and silver bullion is pouring into Asia, particularly China, since the West hungered for things like tea, silks, and spices. Trading nations like the Dutch and Portuguese were capitalizing on this by establishing factories or trading posts all over Asia and selling these goods to the British and to British colonies. Thus, the Dutch were filling their own treasuries with gold and silver bullion and draining that of the Brits. So in Britain, there's a state incentive to encourage trading expeditions and therefore keep as much precious metals within their own economy. So in 1600, a group of visionary, revolutionary innovators, they're rich merchants, decide to pool their money together and disrupt the spice industry by creating a company and getting a royal charter and monopoly over all trade to the east. Kind of a large area. Their business model is simple. Bring back some nice shit from Asia, either by buying it, or if they ran into any European trading vessels along the way, maybe just borrowing theirs permanently. They were pirates. They were state-sponsored pirates. These expeditions were relatively successful, but the company starts deciding to send ships to less Dutch-dominated waters and establish their own trading posts in the west of India. The company sends an emissary to meet with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, who gives them permission to set up a factory in Surat, modern-day Gujarat. Probably being like, what's the worst that can happen?
During the past 200 years, the British gave India law and order. They built roads and railways. They irrigated the lands. But India's future welfare largely depends upon communal harmony.
The company begins setting up factories throughout the subcontinent, making deals with local kingdoms and rulers. Surat's factory is established in 1612, Madras in 1639. Bombay is acquired from the Portuguese in 1668, and Calcutta is established in 1690. They weren't the only Europeans on the subcontinent. There were already a scattering of Portuguese, Dutch, and even Danish factories. Even Danish. And the French begin to acquire their own territory in 1739. For the most part, people are getting along, and the local provinces are getting a cut of their earnings. Everyone's happy. I mean, sure, these traders weren't the best neighbors. Company offers tended to be, how shall I say, Barney Fail's sons. Looking to get some money, get some and get out. If you were, say, a well-to-do trader with a difficult son, you could buy him a slot at the company. He might bring back a fortune and return to the homeland a wealthy nabob. Or he may die of dysentery like on the way there. Either way, he won't be a problem anymore. Throughout the 1600s, the East India Company remains very successful, essentially profiting off of the stability of the Mughal Empire and the riches of the subcontinent, buying at first spices and then textiles. Company officers weren't paid very much. They were encouraged to engage in entrepreneurial creativity, also known as corruption, thievery, and illegal trade. If it was your job to pay the company's taxes to your local prince, you might just skim a little off the top, and the company wouldn't really bat an eye. There was also another way to make money on the subcontinent, by creating militias and lending them out to local princes. I wonder if that will come to bite Mughals in the ass later on. Back in London, the company is making so much money that it gains a reputation as a stable form of investment, widows and orphans stock. Nabobs would return to England and buy titles and parliamentary seats. Because remember, the British killed their king in 1649, and the monarchy never really recovers. So after that point, it's basically Parliament calling the shots. I feel like people don't bring this up. Like, after Oliver Cromwell, most of the monarchs are powerless figureheads. Anyway, like many powerful companies, the company forms lobbying groups in Parliament to push for their own interests, to maintain their monopoly, and to stomp out competition from other British companies. And while there's some resentment in Britain, mostly everyone's making a profit. Everyone's happy. What could possibly go wrong? Children, did you know that World War I was not the first World War? Not even close. The Europeans were having world wars long before the 21st century. They were just super boring, with super boring names. You got the 7 Years' War, the 9 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and let's not forget the War of Austrian Succession. How could we ever forget? The point is, there was a series of international military struggles between emerging European imperial powers, often caused by succession issues due to incest-ridden royals failing to create male heirs. The 1740 War of Austrian Succession is when this becomes India's problem, because France, which nationalizes its compagnie, and the companies start attacking each other, as well involving themselves in local power struggles and having proxy wars on the subcontinent. And it doesn't help that the Mughal Empire is like kind of on the downturn. Aurangzeb spreads the empire, but by his death in 1707, resources are spread pretty thin, and he wasn't exactly the most popular Mughal emperor. And the Mughals are not the only game in town. This, after all, is one bustling subcontinent. You got the Sikhs, you got the Rajputs, you've got the Kingdom of Awadh, you have the Nizam of Hyderabad, the Kingdom of Mysore, you have the Nawab of Bengal. And coming up from up north, you have the Afghans, the Shahs of Persia, who come down once in a while and fuck shit up, as you do. And how can we forget the Marathas, and the good, and the bountiful Chhatrapati Shivaji of Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Airport, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Museum. A moment of silence for all the places left in Mumbai, not yet named after Shivaji. Anyway, the Mughals have started to suffer a bit. In 1736, Nadir Shah of Iran comes and sacks the city of Delhi, turning what was once the richest and one of the most beautiful cities in the world into a heap of carcasses and rubble. Not sure the city has ever recovered.
करीब दशक भर पहले दिल्ली के लोगों को एक मंकी मैन की आहट ने
In 1746, the French attacked the British factory in Madras. And from this moment on, things start heating up, causing the compagnie and the companies to start dabbling in some, light regime change. First with the Kingdom of Hyderabad, and then in the richest province of Bengal. In 1756, a feisty young prince named Suraj-ud-Dawla becomes the new Nawab of Bengal, and quickly becomes frustrated with the company for meddling in his court politics, not paying taxes, and militarizing Calcutta. He orders that the company stops arming their trading posts in Calcutta, and the company completely ignores this order, leading one Mughal to lament, "What honor is left to us when a few traders who have not yet learned to wash their bottoms refuse a royal order?" Again, true then, true today. Normalize bidets, people. Anyway, in 1556, Suraj decides to act. He rouses his army and takes over Calcutta, which leads to what will then be called the Black Hole of Calcutta, an incident where Suraj's army throws a bunch of company officers into a small and unventilated prison, causing at least a couple dozen deaths. Back in Britain, this incident is used to justify the military conquest that happened next. Because remember, Remember, it takes 6 months for a letter from the board of directors to reach India. And by this time, they already fucking took Bengal. The major general at the time was a man named Robert Clive, who in many ways was your quintessential company officer, a ne'er-do-well from Manchester, whose family had shipped him off because he kept getting into fights. Imagine that. Clive had little interest in India. He simply wanted to get rich, go back to England, and become a corrupt MP. I mean, nothing fairer than that. Clive was a talented tactician and aided by Prussian military techniques. Prussia is very good at military techniques. But it also didn't hurt that the company had lots of capital, which companies usually do. Clive begins fighting using hired Indian soldiers, sepoys, against the French, who, using sepoys, respond. I think it's really important to emphasize here that most of the company's army were Indian soldiers. It was like a 6-to-1 ratio of Indians to Europeans. Sometimes I hear people say crazy shit like, England conquered India because they were so strong and manly and they ate a lot of beef. British merchants use money made from India to pay Indians to kill each other. This is why fighting a company is so much more difficult than fighting a kingdom. They don't have the expenses that a government has. They don't have an ideological allegiance to religion or ethnicity. They can hire as many soldiers as they have capital, and they can even bribe members of your court to betray you because they're not interested in being kings. They're only interested in making a profit. And this is exactly what happens to Siraj. This is why he loses the Battle of Plassey in 1757, one of the most important moments in Indian history. And I say battle because it was more of a coup. Robert Clive manages to get into contact with the treacherous commander-in-chief Mir Jafar and tells him that he'll make him the new Nawab if he betrays Siraj. Hardly any European blood is spilled at this so-called battle. Only around 22 of Clive's soldiers are killed, more than half of whom are Indian sepoys. This is the battle that precipitates the eventual annexation of Bengal. No one in Britain had ordered that Bengal be annexed by the company. Not Parliament, not the board of directors. But once the money starts flowing in, once Clive returns to England, possibly the richest person in Britain, everyone stops asking questions, at least until the money runs out. So, it's 1765, and the company has started to take control of Bengal. And maybe you're thinking, so what? The Mughals were foreigners who conquered India after all. So many foreign powers have come and gone and raided and invaded and taken over India. How is this any different? It's different. See, governments, even really shitty ones, have responsibilities. If you govern people, you have to make sure your citizens don't all die, because then you can't tax them. The Mughals may have taxed people, but they also reinvested some of that money back into the economy by building roads, grain storage systems in case of famine. This will become relevant very soon. Investing in education, in agriculture, in manufacturing. Even the worst invaders, like Nader Shah of Persia, would come in, sack the city, kill 20,000 people and leave. And the economy and the people could begin to recover. But the company was not a government. They weren't even raiders. They were worse than raiders. They were a group of horny fail-sons who wanted to get money and get out. A few regime changes and a couple battles after Plassey, the Mughal emperor has signed the Treaty of Allahabad, making the East India Company the official diwani or revenue collector of their richest provinces, Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. What happens next is one of the worst human rights disasters in history, as company officers and their hired local soldiers shake down the peasantry in order to extract as much revenue as possible. Not only does the company overtax the peasantry, they also start to de-industrialize India, ceasing textile manufacturing and forcing the peasantry to plant cash crops instead of food. The company used to import mountains of gold to Bengal and buy processed goods from India and sell them to Britain. But now they use the taxes they take from the peasantry to pay for raw materials to ship to Britain to be manufactured there. Essentially, a rich manufacturing zone is turned into a huge plantation, reliant on British imports. Part of this is political. In 1700, the British government passes the Calico Act, which banned the import of most cotton textiles in order to protect English manufacturing against competition from Bengal. And it works. Britain begins to rapidly industrialize, while company-controlled India de-industrializes. spices. And if that weren't bad enough, remember when I talked about the Mughal grain system? In 1770, just 5 years after the company takes over Bengal, is the first devastating Bengal famine. Unfortunately, it won't be the last under British rule. Estimates for the number of deaths range widely, from 1 million to 10, from a fifth to a third of the population, but no doubt the results were devastating. At first, the company makes huge profits. But then, since you can't tax dead people, and since they've acquired territory they can't afford, the stocks tank. And because the EIC is so interconnected to the British economy, 20 to 30 British banks fail, causing a huge international economic crisis, one that reaches even the Netherlands and the American colonies. The Bank of England decides it has to bail out the East India Company, basically because it's, too big to fail, which is maybe the first case of a state bailing out a private institution. The consequences of this crisis are kind of hard to exaggerate. Parliament grants the company a monopoly to sell their tea to the American colonies, which leads to the Americans starting a little protest called the Boston Tea Party, precipitating the American Revolution itself, because Americans were facing similar, though not nearly as dire, forms of economic exploitation by Britain. Anyway, public favor turns against the company, and the EIC director, Warren Hastings, is put on trial. Parliament uses this as an opportunity to lambast the company, and companies in general, and monopolies, as well as to describe to the British public the deaths and devastation caused by the company in Bengal. After this, a pattern begins to develop between the British government, the East India Company, and India. The company conquers more and more territory by exploiting warring factions, and its governors often ignore the instructions of the board of directors. The company starts losing money due to its expansion. The Bank of England bails them out, and then passes some laws so that the British government starts regulating more and more of the company. And the pattern continues through bribery, trickery, and false treaties, as well as large mercenary armies. The remaining regional powers are defeated one by one. In 1799, Tipu Sultan of Mysore is defeated at the Battle of Srirangapatnam. Between 1775 and 1819, a series of wars takes down the Maratha Confederacy. And between 1845 and 1849, the Anglo-Sikh Wars. The company basically turns into a giant, devastating war machine, spending by the end of the 1700s half of its income on military personnel and hardware. And no one can stop it, not even the British. Public sentiment and parliamentary views are pretty negative, and the company, with the aid of the crown, instead of changing its actions, starts doing some kind of PR fixes. The East India Company Act of 1813 is passed, one that allows Christian missionaries for the people of India's moral improvement, and setting aside 100,000 rupees in order to educate the Indians, the Hindus. In 1829, they start passing the first laws in order to make the very rare practice of sati illegal. All of this was done mostly to justify the British presence, since the company is slowly growing to represent not just a group of merchants, but the British state. Anyway, the inevitable eventually happens. In 1857, 100 years after the Battle of Plassey, these hired Indian soldiers, sepoys, rebel en masse in what is sometimes called the First War of Indian Independence. Although I'm always like, what's the second? Because it was like a non-violence movement. The soldiers had long been resentful of being denied officer positions and became incensed at the company's careless disregard of religious sentiments. The Indian soldiers at this time represented about 85% of military personnel, but the company still manages to quash the rebellion, partially because there was no unity. There was no real Indian identity. This was a construct created years later, and a British idea at the time. Most communities were more concerned with their local regional rivals than this British company. In 1857, many people died. And of course, the British press reports things back to Britain in a less than objective manner. As stories start trickling back to Britain, often fake, about women being and meanwhile, the stories of British officers doing the same thing to local women do not reach the public. War is very bad. Public pressure finally puts an end to the East India Company. And in 1858, the company becomes the British Raj, perhaps the greatest example of corporate rebranding in history. We tend to think that India was conquered by the British. But it wasn't the British at all. It was a company that had wormed its way into seizing control of the British state and hired Indian soldiers to seize land in the company's name. And it wasn't India that was being conquered. It was a diverse subcontinent with many different communities, religions, provinces. And it was this that made the company have such an edge. No one realized until it was too late that the company posed an even greater threat to their kingdoms than their regional rivals. Perhaps because a company is kind of an abstract idea. It's easy to see an enemy kingdom as a rival, an enemy ethnicity, an enemy religion. But a company has no ideals. It has no face. It's a kind of headless monster, which is exactly why it can be so vicious, because it has one goal and one goal only: to extract resources. And that's exactly what the British Raj continues to do, all in the name of governance. But in reality, the schools, the trains, the hospitals were all built in order to facilitate that resource extraction. And the myth of a civilizing mission was made for the British public at home, to soothe their consciousness as they sipped their plantation-grown tea. Some things, again, never change. The exact same exploitative economic policies flourished during the Raj era, the same monopolies. And many flourish today. There are still tea plantations originally set up by company officers that ship the best of Indian tea to British manufacturing companies, which then distribute it around the world under a British brand. And India still has to import many things because of the cash crops it was forced to grow and the deindustrialization that started in the 1700s. And developing nations struggle with their reliance on Western imports to this day, because that's what colonialism is: a contract that makes robbery systematic and, civilized.